I'm Kevin O'Connor. I am an agent by day, and I have started the Center for Nonfiction as my Columbia Community College Community Scholars Project, teaching folks about what the needs of publishers are, and understanding how a little bit about publishing works, trying to make that a little bit more transparent. So tonight we have really three amazing guests. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in a minute, but this is kind of the rundown that we're going to really talk about today. We're going to really focus on a narrative nonfiction, and we'll talk a little bit about why. We're going to talk about the need for having a platform and what that entails, and talk about a little bit about what the agent does and what the acquisitions process is. And then we'll talk a little bit about mechanics. But in the first up, I'd love to introduce Naomi Eisenbeiss, who is an agent at InkWell. Naomi, you want to say a few things?
Sure. Hi, I'm Naomi. I'm originally from Houston, but my mom is Japanese, my dad is German, and I actually studied political science in school, which did not help me much in my career. And then ended up working in Shanghai at a literary festival, which kind of got me into publishing in America. I've been at InkWell for about 4 years now. I primarily deal with authors who write fiction. I know that this is the Center for Nonfiction, but I do focus on memoir and a lot of visual books in that genre. And so I hope that we can kind of answer some questions tonight.
Excellent. Naomi, you want to jump? Pronoy, you want to jump in?
Hi, everyone. Kevin, thanks for having me. And it's great to see or not see all of you. Can you hear me all right? Okay. So I'm a senior editor, primarily focused on nonfiction at Little Brown, which is the prestige imprint of Hachette Book Group, one of the big five. I started my career at Simon & Schuster, and I originally planned on being an academic and then decided to forego that path. And this was prior to the adjunct crisis, but I was around a lot of grad students who were complaining about funding and all this, and I thought life of the mind doesn't seem to be as ideal as it once appeared. So I didn't know what to do, and the only through line of my interests, if it wasn't academia, was books. So I took an internship. I was in North Carolina, and the only trade house in North Carolina was Algonquin, which I interned at. I was a horrible intern, and I did that for about 4 months, and then moved to New York, worked at Simon & Schuster, the flagship imprint under the publisher, who I guess is now CEO and then now publisher again, then moved over to Macmillan Books, worked at Picador and St. Martin's, where I started publishing a series of nonfiction across a range of categories: experts, history, politics, narrative nonfiction more broadly, and then have, over the past 2 years, been at Little Brown, primarily focused on history, politics, big idea books from journalists and experts, and have been broadening the nonfiction program that has been historically defined by big fiction authors like James Patterson and Malcolm Gladwell and David Sedaris and Alan Hildebrand, and sort of bringing in the sort of next generation of authors that can sit comfortably on that shelf.
Awesome. Thank you, Pronoy. And I'm really excited to have Makayla Tabron with us. Makayla is just at the beginning of her career. She's a recent Howard University grad and is an editorial assistant at Amistad. So if you could tell us a little bit about what Amistad does and how you got into publishing, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So like Kevin mentioned, my name is Makayla. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for having me. I'm a recent graduate of Howard University. I double majored in English and political science. I'm also currently getting a master's at NYU in English and American Literature. And I'm an editorial assistant at Amistad, HarperCollins. So Amistad is an imprint of HarperCollins that really focuses on Black literature throughout the diaspora. educate, empower, entertain is kind of a 3-word summary for what we like to do. And so I did a couple of internships. So I just started, like Kevin mentioned. I have been working at Amistad for a little over 6 months. I did a few internships before this. I started at Rowman and Littlefield my sophomore year of college, but that was the year that COVID hit, and so they kind of sent us all home. But I was there long enough to know that this is the field that I wanted to get into. So I did some agency internships. I worked at Day Fiore and Company. I interned at the New Press. And so I stayed at Day Fiore and Company until I got this job. And so I did a lot of meet and greets, a lot of coffee one-on-ones, and just kept getting introduced to new people who would suggest places that I should look into, places that I should apply. So I'm happy to talk more about that if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much, Makayla. That is really, really awesome. I came to publishing late in life, in my 40s, after having worked in educational media and promising myself that I would never work in publishing because it wasn't really a great way to make money. But it is amazing. The people are so great, and you get to do so many amazing things. As Pronoy was saying, the life of the mind this is the place to be. So really amazing projects that I get to work on. And Makayla in particular has been a great cheerleader for me in some of my projects. So I'm really happy to have her here today. One of the things that I asked folks to focus on today was really narrative nonfiction. So nonfiction, obviously there's fiction and nonfiction. Historically, they've made up about each has made up about 50% of the sales for a trade publisher at bookstores. If anything, coming out of the pandemic, Christian McLean, who runs Bookscan's data for it's now I can't remember the name of the company, but it used to be NPD. She tells us that if anything, coming out of the pandemic, people are focusing more on fiction. Maybe they want to get away from the world, but nonfiction genres obviously are anything from biography to self-help to histories, medicine. They can get very, very technical. But I've asked people today to focus about narrative nonfiction, because when I talk to editors, they always say that's what they're looking for. And Pronoy, I think I'll hand this one to you because you have the most experience in acquiring narrative nonfiction. Why narrative nonfiction? What is it about that gets an editor excited, and what is it that gets the reader excited about narrative in particular?
So I think the reason why the emphasis is on narrative nonfiction, irrespective of category, whether it's, and this mostly applies to people who aren't traditionally writing narratively. I mean, journalists by trade have probably an easier predilection to understand narrative. I mean, that is of course different if you're an op-ed writer or something, but investigative reporters are writing narratively and doing reporting. So I think the primary distinction about narrative nonfiction is that it is storytelling, and it's much easier from a commercial standpoint to get into deep issues, however complex, through particular characters and stories that illustrate those ideas. For example, one of the books I brought to show that is a sort of, I think, one of the best sort of executions of this that was published in recent years is called this book called Copeland. And Chris Leonard and I are actually friendly. He's a terrific reporter. He's for many years was at ProPublica, and I think is now at the Times. And I get projects all the time that want to talk about things like American capitalism or the decline of, or the financialization of Wall Street, or like what income inequality is. And often it's very difficult to I mean, I've made this mistake myself. I published 2 books on monopolies. Everybody wants to talk about monopolies, but if you talk about it from a 30-foot view, nobody wants to read about it. So the narrative approach allows you to sort of obliquely approach big issues through a kind of bait and switch. And I use Cokeland as a good example because what he manages to do is place Coke Industries and the growth of Coke Industries as a perfect lens into what happened to the American economy by someone who exploited all of the opportunities that presented itself from the 1950s to the present. And in doing so, after I read the book, I remember telling Chris, I feel like Charles Koch, whatever your personal opinion of him is the James Bond of capitalism. And you discover that through the stories that he tells, and the stories are remarkable. I mean, from federal regulators trying to chase him down to the ways in which he brings to life what it's like to work inside an oil refinery, to how there's a sort of race to, co-opt and destroy competition, all of which link back to broader issues, but are told through very specific stories. And I think that's in many ways what distinguishes a more academic treatment from a trade treatment. It enables people to read, it's more accessible, and it simplifies things that they care about, but in a way that is compelling, engaging, and readable.
I think that's awesome. I mean, my own experience is that most of the proposals that I get are strings of pearls, where it's perfectly formulated little essays, little looks at things, and then people try to string them together. But there's something about the narrative where you're on the journey, and maybe you're watching one individual person, or you're watching a group of people, the story of a company, go over ups and downs and overcome situations and problems, and you're kind of rooting for them, even if you hate them or you care about what happens to them. One way that I find really works well for a beginning author is the biography, because that has a natural narrative to it, right? Somebody's born, they get educated, they leave their family, some things happen to them, and they've got to discover themselves and make a name for themselves, and then obviously most people die. So I'm going to go out on a limb here at some point. And that really works well because the reader will go on that journey. And without that aspect of it, it can be very hard to hold your attention, and it doesn't feel as narratively satisfying to the reader to read, 500 pages worth of individual essays. Naomi, do you have anything that you'd add to that? Anything?
Sure. I mean, I agree with everything that you guys have said. I think that any art, right, if you just kind of look at it in a macro level, is most effective when the artist sort of takes its audience by the hand and leads them through it. And I think the same is true with nonfiction or books, especially because, you can spout all of these different facts, or, what you were talking about, this like string method of like, you have all of these different pieces and you try and kind of piece it together. But I think that creating a narrative is a much more accessible and kind of, a kinder environment for a reader to kind of understand what the writer is trying to give, or the message that they're trying to receive. And I think that that's really important. I think one example that's really good is Bad Blood by John Carreyrou. I don't know if anybody's read it. And that's also a story that just kind of blew up, right? There's like Hulu and like docuseries and podcasts related to Elizabeth Holmes and her trajectory. But Bad Blood is really, it's so well written. It's kind of like investigative journalism at its peak. And you have all of these different perspectives, different lives and experiences that are braided into one narrative arc really beautifully. And so I think that's just a really good example of a very kind of nebulous and complex situation being told to a reader in a very understandable and digestible way, even if you don't know anything about tech or, medical industry. So I think that is like a good example of kind of what narrative nonfiction can do.
And even building off of that, and Bad Blood is a good example of this, is what distinguishes a commercial or a trade book from an academic text is that you have to meet the public where they are, and they are not necessarily Wall Street stockbrokers. They're not angel investors. They're not entrepreneurs. They're not familiar with cancer treatments or trying to magically solve how to take a prick of blood and change the world. And so it's one thing to sort of say to a group of experts who are familiar with the material and can discuss it at a higher level. And it's another thing to show actively how one creates a scam of epic proportion that really you wouldn't be able to understand any other way. And the building of Elizabeth Holmes and the psychology of Elizabeth Holmes and the ability that she was able to sort of con people doesn't make sense unless you actually see it illustrated. And once you see it illustrated, it becomes a very powerful form of persuasion. And it humanizes exactly how decisions are made in these kinds of circumstances. I mean, she got contracts with the US government. And it's hard for people to understand, well, how do you get a contract with the US government? And that's what Corellia was able to show. And that is what commercial books are looking for. They're trying to meet the reader where they are, and readers are not as familiar, any reader, with what these entail. And so, especially for academics writing for the trade audience, they have to understand that many of their readers are not other academics. And so they don't understand economics. They don't understand business. They don't understand fundamental things. And the best way to convey that is often through characters, through humanizing those stories and making those concepts come alive through action.
That is really great. I was thinking, and Naomi, thank you for the Bad Bloods suggestion. I mean, that the whole fact that, you know, George Shultz, who's a name that a lot of people would know, he's a former Secretary of State, you know, so you feel like an intersection of him and his life and his times, that he gets pulled into this as a board member of Elizabeth Holmes's company. And that kind of shows how she figured out how to use power to give herself authority and authenticity, even though she didn't really have anything there. It's in our last conversation, we talked a little bit about the tipping point, and there's an example of Sesame Street using being very, very focused on individual clips of like a minute to 2 minute, because the idea that kids couldn't follow a long form narrative of 22 minutes or a half an hour. And Blue's Clues kind of blew that out of the water, and it showed that kids could actually follow the entire episode and actually got more out of the episode. They could retain more when it was put on a plot line. They could go through the feelings of the character and the ups and the downs, and they would remember key plot points, and they would remember key learning points by putting it onto that plot line. Makayla, do you have any thoughts about nonfiction books you like that you found that they have that the people that you're working with are working on and talking about, and why they're important?
Yeah, for sure. I think Pronoy and Naomi covered a lot of it, but I'd also like to add that I think it's important because it allows an audience to really get engrossed into important subject matters. And I think that you can discuss like really important historical facts through a lens that's more engrossing to an audience. And so one that I found particularly interesting, and this is going to sound like such a shameless plug, but it's really not. It's just, I think, a perfect example of it, is a book we're coming out with soon called Our Secret Society by Tanisha Ford. I don't have a copy of it because it isn't published yet, but it's coming out, I want to say like next fall or so. And so it's both social history and biography, and it's about Molly Moon, who was the founder of the National Urban League Guild. She was like an extraordinary fundraiser, And she hosted this Beaux Arts Ball, which was the social event of New York that kind of rivals the Met Gala that we have today. And so the author brings Mali into focus in a way that we've never seen before, and gets to discuss this important figure, and also talks about a little known yet highly important aspect of the civil rights movement, which was like the powerhouse fundraising efforts, like the luncheons, the galas, and things of that nature. And so I think that the best way to tell this kind of story was narrative nonfiction. And so I think it's an excellent example.
Thank you so much, Makayla. I would ask actually Pronoy and Naomi and Makayla, if you could mention the names of the books that you're talking about in the chat. We can capture those, and I will add those to my notes from and post them onto my website, and we'll talk about how to get in touch with me afterwards. And if you do have questions, feel free to write them in the chat, and we'll take them live. One of the things that's really come up for me in the last couple of years, the last 10 years of being an agent, is more and more, what is the author's platform? How many people can they reach before the book is before we even try to sell the book? And it used to be how many Facebook followers and how many Twitter followers, and now it's much more, who's talking about you on Book Talk and Instagram. I'd love to have a conversation about like what the author needs to bring to the table. Pronoy was saying earlier before we started that the book is the last thing. The book is the last thing that you do. It's not the first thing, and I'll let him speak to exactly what he means by that. But Naomi, you want to kick us off about the platform?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I think platform is important in certain situations. It really depends on the author as well. I'm not going to ask a debut literary novelist to make sure that they have an Instagram and Twitter account, mostly because they often don't have it, but also because it seems like a moot point. But if you want to talk about sort of authority and you are an academic talking about your research, then I think it's important to have a platform in the sense that you are recognized within your community and that you're considered an authority on that topic. So in that way, I think platform is important, especially when we're talking about narrative nonfiction or nonfiction in general. And in terms of just like social media, I think what we are all kind of baffled by, as agents, especially with something like Book Talk, is it's this organic beast that nobody's really able to control. Editors might try and send some influencers their books or, upcoming titles. And if the TikToker doesn't like it, they're not going to post about it. So it's not necessarily something that we as part of like the established industry are able to control. It's more this phenomenon that is happening and we're kind of riding a wave. And that happens also a lot of times with like backlist titles often. Book Talk is often talking about books that are not new. They're maybe 5-10 years old. And they're kind of having this resurgence, which obviously we're all really grateful for. But again, it's not something that we necessarily are able to kind of track and predict. But I'm also curious to hear about, from the editorial side, how they view platform and kind of how it differs in terms of what kind of deals they're offering.
Excellent. Kelly, can you talk to how important the author's platform is as you're talking to and considering projects?
Absolutely. I think that everyone should try to build a platform. Let me say that. I think if you're not a social media person, like don't push yourself, but I think that it's absolutely something that will help you. I think an editor can be really sold on your book, but we also have to convince other people. And a question that I see pop up all the time in these conversations is, what is their platform? What does their platform look like? And that doesn't necessarily just mean like how many followers they have, but just how engaged their audience is, and how well known they are as far as if they have authority on this subject. I think this is just something that we see pop up in these conversations over and over again. So I think it's helpful for you all to consider building that platform now before you start trying to pitch a project. I think it'll just be helpful in the long run.
Awesome. Thank you, Makayla. Pronoy?
Yeah, so I share the sentiments of both Makayla and Naomi, and I get asked this question a lot, and what I find, I'm going to take the writer's side on this a little bit because I think it's really frustrating when you don't work at the New York Times and have that institutional backing, or the Washington Post, or you're a diplomat, to go out while simultaneously trying to build a writing career. What I think is more important, and this can apply to platform building. I mean, is to think entrepreneurially. I think what matters in the end is, do you understand your category? Do you understand the book that you're writing and how it distinguishes itself on the shelf? Do you even know where on the shelf it would sit? Do you know the other writers who have been writing about it? Have you had contact with them? Building those kind of networks, building that kind of familiarity, building that kind of expertise is, to me, a kind of platform in and of itself. For example, I've worked with people who from afar don't have significant followings necessarily, but what they do have is access to material that makes them singularly capable of writing a book. I'm in the process of trying to buy a project on Toni Morrison, and the person I've been talking with has custodial rights to the public papers at Princeton University. She's not someone who has got 30, 40,000 followers on Twitter, but she is the only person who could write this book because of her academic expertise, as well as her ability to cull through the papers and the access that she has. And in having that access, she is friends with people like Imani Perry and people like Caitlin Greenidge and others who have, over the course of her work life, become friends, colleagues, and supporters. And so, to me, I think, and when I say that the book is the last stop, I also think it's important to think, well, for example, I'll give you a good example. I once went into an author meeting where I asked the author, in modeling your project, what kind of book inspired you? It was a nonfiction project. She was a reporter, and she said, Charles Dickens. And I thought, okay, well, it seems like you haven't really thought about contemporary journalism at all. Like, what is going on in contemporary journalism, like Charles Dickens? I mean, that's not a model. And so familiarity with the space, an understanding of how the book fits within that space, knowing where and how it distinguishes itself, that kind of, I think, element should become part of how you think about moving into the trade. And that can be reaching out and connecting with writing communities. It could be leaning on other people who have written, having mentors, working through, or having access or being dogged about finding access to materials that you have uncovered and that you that are yours, and that makes you sort of the person to write the book. So I think platform can sometimes be misleading because a lot of people have big platforms, but they're really good at social media, but they're not necessarily people that are followed because they write books. Two good examples is Gia Tolentino, great writer off social media. Ta-Nehisi Coates, incredible writer off social media. I think it's a little more complicated. And I think that the issue is, and I share this frustration, is that publishers, given the challenges in the market and given all of the forces that we're all wrestling with, often rely on this thing called a platform, which in many ways sometimes means something and sometimes means nothing, in part because they're hoping that the author can bring a kind of arsenal that can work as a crutch in promoting the book. And that sometimes puts undue pressure on authors. So I don't like to say that it's essential. I like to think of it as work on the project and also think entrepreneurially, because entrepreneurially can be how to ensure that nobody can say, well, why are you and why this? You have answers to all of these things. You know this, you know the genre, you know the topic, you know the space, you've read the books in the area, you understand what's missing or not missing, and you come fully formed with a sense of authority. And I think that itself can do wonders.
That's awesome. I was thinking of a couple different things while you were talking. One is, I'll put it in the chat. I recommend people read the Robert Gottlieb avid reader. He's a Columbia grad and Columbia grad school grad, I believe. He was an editor at Knopf and the New Yorker and a friend of Toni Morrison's, among other folks, and was the editor on Catch 22. And he writes about and Pronoy said you did the paperback of that?
Well, I was scary.
Because he's scary smart, I would imagine, or just scary.
He's smart, yeah, but he's also scary. You would send him an email and he would never email me back, and within 30 seconds my phone would ring and it would be him, and he'd be like, what is this? I'll forget. And then he would hang up. And so every time I had to email him, I had to make sure I was at my desk because I knew the phone was going to ring. But yes, I mean, it's a very good book about the publishing industry.
He writes about the ability, I think, and Pronoy, correct me if I'm wrong, about putting an ad in the New York Times for Catch 22, and then it just kind of blew up. Can you imagine an ad in a newspaper leading to book sales? Like, that is just beyond me. I used to work for Kids Bop, which was the kids singing pop songs, and the one thing that we had was an amazing marketing machine and buying time on Nickelodeon. And so we would just bombard people with the commercials again and again. At times it was 7 times a day. And a certain percentage of people would buy, who saw the commercial, would go on to buy it. The content, not necessarily the greatest content in the world, not the greatest recordings, but really got the meta developmental need, met an audience need, and then really met the marketing need. I worked for a publisher, and at one point the publisher was talking to our CEO about all the different formats of a major movie that had a book that was based on a book, and she showed all the different formats of the book that were going to come out, the Target exclusive, the Walmart exclusive, the Barnes and Noble exclusive. And she explained to the CEO that the publisher doesn't create the momentum, it follows it. And I was horrified, because as somebody who's been in marketing, if I ever told that to my CEO, like, hey, if it takes off, I'll do well. And if it doesn't, sorry, like I have my head on a platter. That this was not acceptable answer.
And just quickly, I'm sorry, I'm taking up a lot of time, but you're reminding me of one of my favorite stories in publishing, which is really, I think, an indictment of publishing, but also I think an empowering story for people. In hindsight, a book like The New Jim Crow seems like it was made to take over the list and change the conversation. And in many ways it did. But I spoke with the editorial director of the New Press and asked, how that book came about. And in many ways, first of all, the New Press is an independent press, a very wonderful press, but they're not part of the Big Five. So let's acknowledge first that The New Jim Crow, one of the most important books of the last decade, was not published by one of the big five. And that when that book came out, the New Press, which doesn't have the kind of resources that Hachette has or HarperCollins has, they couldn't even get a New York Times review. You know, they couldn't even get the kind of coverage. Forget about an ad in the New York Times. They couldn't even get a New York Times review. But Michelle Alexander, as we now know, she knew that this book didn't need a New York Times review. And so what she did was she went on a tour that she paid for, going across Black churches along the South and giving a speech and talking about how when you come in every Sunday and you see that your brother is not here, a month later, your uncle is not here. Why is that? I have a term for it. It's called the New Jim Crow. And it electrified the speaking circuit that she was on, primarily Black churches across the South. And in doing so, all of a sudden, there was this convergence of sales that started to bubble up that then the New York Times paid attention to. And they were like, what is this book that seems to be rising and climbing the ranks? And then a review came. And then this, you know. So in many ways, Michelle Alexander intuitively understood that she didn't need to rely on the institutions that were decision makers, and went out and did it herself and proved everybody wrong. And so that to me speaks to what I mean by this sort of entrepreneurial, you know, she knew exactly who the audience was. She went to them directly, and she did it without the support of a publisher who believed in the book but couldn't necessarily provide the kind of plan that she herself developed. And in doing so, changed the course of publishing that now the big five has been trying to recreate for the last 5 years. So, you know, I think that shows the power of, you know, the publishers are not always right, and there is no guarantee, and sometimes things happen that are just remarkable, and they multiple factors figure into that.
Yeah, I mean, just as the way that you would, if you made I'm going to sound old, if you made a CD, right? You couldn't just put out a CD and put it in Walmart or Target. You really need to support that and get people to know your name, just like anything else. I'd like to talk a little bit about proposals. So one of the nice things about nonfiction in particular, it's the one area that you can still sell a book on spec. So you don't need to have written the entire book. You can have a couple of chapters, usually two or three chapters in an introduction, and probably about a 50 to 70 page proposal. Naomi, can you speak a little bit to the proposal, what the format is, how people find out about the format? They can also email me to find out about the format, and how you work with folks on proposals, if that's something you do.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a proposal is kind of this incredible gift to a writer, because you don't have to sink in all of the hours that it takes to write a book and still, you know, secure an advance that would then fund you to write it. So there are definitely, you know, a proposal can look any different way, but there are definite like fundamental building blocks to it. So again, because this is sort of like a sales pitch, you really need to make sure that the publisher knows everything that's going into the book. So it has to be as detailed as possible. So you're going to have sort of like an overview message of why you're writing this book, why the market needs it, and why specifically now. I think those are kind of like three really important questions you should answer right off the bat. Also, who you are, do you have this, you know, platform, authenticity, whatever you want to call it? But also there are certain sections like marketing and promotion where you can be very, very blatant about who you know, who's willing to promote it for you. You know, if you know Oprah, say it. Like you can be really very detailed there. And then you're going to have like a chapter overview of all of the chapters and sort of summaries there. And those are going to be, again, pretty detailed. And then at the end, you're going to have sort of an excerpt or a couple of excerpts so that the editor reading it knows exactly what you're going to be writing. They can visualize it. They just know that sort of the legwork has to be done, but they understand what will be said in this book. I think in terms of like an agent-author relationship when it comes to a proposal, you know, you and the agent are going to try and get it to its most sort of saleable form. An agent is never going to sort of like line edit anything for you. It's going to be kind of like top line edits or ideas. And so they're going to work with you on more sort of like larger moving pieces of like how to bring this all together. So if something's missing, that's where an agent is going to be able to say that you need to include something, or that it's just not getting across the way that you would want it necessarily. In terms of also kind of how fully formed it is, personally, you know, if it's an existing client and they have this idea that they want to discuss and they want to talk about focus and where to take it, I'm absolutely happy to talk about it. I am less eager when it's a new client and they're sort of just forming this idea and don't really have kind of the direction in place, just because for me, you know, it's also time investment, and I would rather have a more focused proposal or, you know, excerpt, sort of something that they can show me that I can also see kind of like the clear direction of it, and not that we have to kind of like redirect together. But that's just from an agent's point of view.
That's awesome. Makayla, you're on the front lines of getting the proposals. What's that like? Do you see common mistakes? Do you get excited? Like what's it like to work with them?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly add another aspect that I think is important for proposals or comps. Or like Pronoy mentioned earlier, thinking about the books that your book is in conversation with, where it would fit on the shelf, because I think that's on our end, that's important because that's how we can figure out how many copies that you can kind of be estimated to sell. But I enjoy reading proposals. I enjoy reading proposals more than I enjoy reading like a full-fledged manuscript, because like Naomi mentioned, it's kind of just like a snapshot. And so we get a glimpse of your ideas without you having to have put in all of this work. As far as common mistakes, I feel like as long as the person has an agent, it typically comes in pretty good shape. I think the one thing that I dislike is when a proposal is super, super long. Like if it's over 100 pages, you've lost my attention. It's a lot to handle. But I think most of the time proposals come to us in pretty good shape because most of the time people have agents. Yeah.
Thanks, Makayla. Pronoy?
I agree with everything, and so I'm not going to repeat what Naomi and Makayla are saying. I think the thing that I'm often struck by, being bludgeoned by proposals multiple times a day, is I feel like one of the things that really strikes me, and these are sometimes they're people who are you know, they have all the credentials, they have all the bells and whistles, you know, but they seem to be uncertain about not just what their book is, but how it is distinct, what its core argument is, what it's trying to say, what it's trying to do. I feel the most confident when proposals are not front loaded by a bunch of hyperbole. Like oh, this is like, barbarians at the gate. Well, no, it's not like barbarians at the gate. Or this is like Bad Blood. Well, no, it's not like that. Those are like singular stories. Like, I don't, like, you can't recreate Bad Blood. So what I tend to enjoy when I read a proposal is the author is really, really well versed in what they're doing. It doesn't mean that I can necessarily pursue it. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily for me, but it's like something that I completely appreciate. Like, this author not only knows how to write the book that they are that they are trying to write, but they have complete command over the material and they have complete command over the space. They know, for example, why, if they're writing about climate change, why their book on climate change is different from other books on climate change. The angle that they're taking is distinct. They know other books that have come out that have similar attributes, but they know exactly why their book is different. And I love when authors go in and almost annotate the comps by saying, look, like, this book came out, and while it did very well, in many ways, it was narrower than what I'm looking at. And it's narrower because they didn't have access to X, Y, and Z. It shows me an authority. I like to say that I love proposals where the person seems to know so much more than the proposal suggests, which means that they are really, really nimble and even capable of pivoting or broadening or expanding or rethinking. Like, they just have a complete control and are in complete control over their material and exactly know what they want to do and exactly know how they want to do it and why they want to do it and why it serves a public audience. And those intuitive, subtle cues can surface in a proposal in a way that, gives me confidence that they're not shooting in the dark. They really know what they're attempting to do. And that level of confidence, I think, is extremely powerful.
That's great. I live and breathe proposals. That's primarily what I'm working on every day. It's what I like to do. And hopefully I'm getting better at it as an editor and as a coach. There are, as Naomi was saying, if you just Google it, there are a lot of different formats that are out there. If you email me, and I'll put this up at the end, but if you email me at ko142@columbia.edu, ko142@columbia.edu, I will send you, what I have on proposals, and I have a little conversation about what a comp is and how to find comps and things like that. This is not rocket science. It's not something that you haven't already, people haven't already done, but it is a great sales tool. And it's a really great way to hone your message and make, and show the world, that you're the right person to write the book and that there's an audience. Probably even more importantly, there's an audience of people who really want to read it. Naomi, do you want to talk a little bit about how you find clients?
Sure. I think there are a couple different ways. I am a huge proponent of the submissions folder. So I think a lot of senior agents might not look at it as much, but, and I don't know if everyone's familiar with that, but every agency is going to have a website where they're going to direct their authors to send their queries to. And usually you can sort of specify who you want to send it to. And then, that agent will just go through the folder for whatever is directed towards them. So I look at that all the time. That is how I found many clients. Another way, again, and what I'm looking for there is typically somebody who is not like formatting like crazy, who's able to kind of like follow the rules and just like stick to what we've asked for. So it's, quick bio, pitch, and an excerpt. And then if I've liked the excerpt, then I'll ask for more. Another way that I find clients is through my other clients. So if you have, friends who are agented, honestly, and they're willing to kind of put themselves on the line for you, yeah, I would definitely ask them if you're allowed to sort of contact their agent. I'm super open to that and always at least have a conversation with somebody who's come from a client. So those are probably the two main ways. If I'm looking at it from like an author's point of view of how to find an agent, things like manuscript wish list are great, query tracker. You can go to Publishers Marketplace and look at what an agent is looking for. But I also think, and this is something I do even when I'm looking for editors, I think it's a great way or a great thing to, if you're reading a book that you love and you think is kind of similar to something that you're writing, if you go back to the acknowledgements, almost every single time they're going to say thank you to their agent and also to their editor. So that kind of gives you a nice like way to visualize the landscape of agents and kind of what they're looking for and who they are. That's sort of, one-offs. But I do think that it's a pretty good way to kind of get a good feel of agents and who they are.
Excellent. And I have information about all the websites that Naomi talked about, and I will email them to you if you get in touch with me. Pronoy, can you talk a little bit about like, hey, you get a proposal and you're interested in it. What's that process like? How do you sell it internally?
It's important to know that each publisher, I mean, one of the reasons why agents are so integral is that each publisher is coming to these projects and has different goals and different needs when they're looking at books, and it's not all in a vacuum. So some publishers are driven by, they really do look for academics who are on the cutting edge of and pivoting towards the trade. Some publishers are extremely commercially driven and are really looking for, what you would call book club or really commercial type projects. Some are looking for pop culture. The conversations in-house often become there are multiple reasons why projects are turned down or accepted, and it's not necessarily personal. This is why I always say, like, don't take a rejection personally, because there are just so many factors that go into it, and there are a lot of editors, myself included. I mean, I have fought tooth and nail to buy books that I said were like, this is great, and then I lost them, and they're hard. It's hard to turn things down. It's hard to say no, especially when you fall in love with something. But these are group decisions, and those decisions are made with guidance from not only the publisher but from the sales team, and for marketing and publicity. And so there is a lot that goes into it, and often, it might have nothing to do. It might have not. It's not a personal thing. And also, publishers like Little Brown, for example, have very few spaces. I mean, we don't publish a lot of books, so turning things down is more normal than otherwise. We have to, by nature of the way our business runs. And so we don't fill buckets. We're not just like constantly acquiring the same economist or the same journalist over and over again. Like, we are very, very deliberate and curated. And so it's important to have an agent who can sort of map this out and really sort of target, just like when authors are looking for agents, they need to target agents who are interested in the stuff that they're doing. Like, if you're doing serious nonfiction and you ping an agent who does children's books, like you're wasting your time. In the same way, agents are really targeting editors who they know are vested in these areas and know how to publish them, and are also going to houses that know how to publish them. But there are also extenuating circumstances. I mean, for example, like a lot of books on climate change that I get, and I've got a couple that we have a lot of resources behind, and we need to publish well, right? So we're not really at this moment. It's much harder to convince the team to take on more until we see these projects out, and that's not something an author can control. That's a timing issue, and it's why I like to say that, like, you want to just keep persevering, because these things are not necessarily personal at all. I mean, they can come down to the smallest thing, and it could even be something that you have no control over whatsoever. I don't have control over, you don't have control over, the agent has no control over, which is that there was just a book somewhat similar that really underperformed, for example, which is a horrible thing to say, but it does impact the way people think, and it drives a kind of mindset. And publishers by nature tend to be relatively conservative in how they approach these things, and so it becomes it's a lot. The calculus is often opaque, and sometimes it's illogical and very subjective, and so it's not a meritocracy by any means, and that's just a fact. So I would not take rejections personally, and there are plenty of great examples of rejected authors who have gone on to kill it. So
I think to add to that point, like, I often tell my clients this, but I think even before you have an agent, the sooner you become comfortable with rejection, the better, because it will happen at any stage. And like Pronoy was saying, it actually doesn't mean that what you're doing is bad. It just might be the wrong timing, the wrong fit. They didn't have an emotional connection to the book, whatever it is. But rejection is part of the process. And yes, it feels really personal, but it shouldn't, just because you're just a person that has sent them this proposal or book or whatever it is. So that is a good way to overcome that. Sorry.
Excellent. Makayla, do you have anything to add about the acquisitions process?
Yeah, do you think it would be helpful if I gave like a step-by-step?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I don't acquire yet because I'm an editorial assistant, but I can talk a little bit about the process. So when my manager gets a submission, I'm often the first person to take a look at it. And so what I'll do is write a reader's report, writing about the strengths and the weaknesses of the proposal. And then I report to the editorial director. So in my reader's report, I'll say who I think would be the best fit for the editor. Sometimes it's not the person that originally received the submission. And so if we're interested in the proposal or in the manuscript, we'll put it on the editorial notes. And so this is really important because it's the first time that the publisher sees it, the first time the lead marketer and the lead publicist sees it. So it's like it's important to have a really strong introduction. And so we put it on the notes and we discuss it within Ed Board. And so then after that, typically you have like an author meeting or something of the sort. And so what we do, I'm sure it's different for every house, but what we do is we present 6 questions to the publisher. And so those are questions like, why this book? How many will it sell? Just generic questions that kind of inform why this book, why now, and how well we think it will do. And so with that, we request like a P&L, which is a profit and loss statement. And we plug in a whole bunch of numbers to see what kind of advance we can offer, and things of that nature. And so then once the publisher gets all of that information, they can decide whether they agree with your stance or not. And then from then you can make an offer.
That is awesome. That's awesome. All right, so you've made an offer. I'm going to skip over the agenting part of like the agent beating up the editor and getting better terms. Actually, let's pause a minute there. Naomi, can you talk about the basic terms for a book deal, like advance royalties, subrights?
Sure. Yeah. So an advance is how much essentially a publisher is willing to pay you or the author for a book. And again, that's sort of a publisher making a bet. They're going to say, this is the amount that we think we're going to be able to recoup through the sales of this book. And so it's something that we look at in terms of as an agent, obviously is, we want a higher advance, but it's also payout. So payout is usually in fours. It's usually signing, DNA, so delivery and acceptance, publication, and then second publication. So that's usually hardcover and then paperback. So, obviously getting the author more money quicker is better. But typically it is those 4 payout schedules. So advance territory is really important. Certain agencies, especially like at InkWell, we have a pretty robust foreign rights department. So that means that if we only sell US, North America, Canada to a publisher, we can actually make more commission and also more money for the author by selling through our own foreign rights team. So that means, we have co-agents in like Germany and Japan, and they sell there. And so you're making, more money on the same book, essentially. Things like subrights, there are things like first serial, second serial. First serial is going to be something those are kind of like industry standards, also like ebook audio. Those aren't going to change very much, but first serial is when it's sort of like almost like a teaser trailer where before the book has come out, an excerpt comes out in a magazine or publication, then you're going to get like 90% of whatever that amount is. Second serial is the same, but after the book has been published. If the publisher is going to sell it within an English speaking market, but not in the US, your percentage is going to be higher. It's going to be like 80% to the author. Yeah. Does that sort of answer your question about subrights? But
yeah, I think so. I love that kind of stuff, and most people like fall asleep. But it's important that you have an agent who knows their way around that, because that's
right.
a way definitely to make money and protect your interests.
Yeah, for sure.
And you want to keep television and movie and all that good stuff, right?
Yes,
and not
yeah.
give those to a publisher.
Yeah, and I took on a client last year who she had secured a deal unagented, and it was such a
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was such a mess. And I had taken a look at her contract then afterwards. And not that all publishers are predatory, but this contract in particular was very predatory and very grabby with rights. And, the option clause was not beneficial towards the author. So having an agent definitely guarantees that your contract is at least going to be up to industry standard. And is going to have sort of your best interest in mind rather than the publishers. And again, like film and TV, merchandising, gaming rights, those should all be reserved always. But sometimes, I don't know, sometimes they're not. And there are certain publishers that don't reserve the rights to the author. But we mostly choose not to.
Yeah, we don't even send to them for the most part. Yeah. Makayla, can you talk a little bit about what happens once the contract is signed and you're working with the author, you're getting the drafts?
Yeah, so I think it depends a lot on who your editor is. When I first started, I was working with an editor who's very different than the editor that I'm working with now. But if you're working with nonfiction, sometimes they'll prefer that you only send 2 or 3 chapters at a time. Some people want the entire thing. But essentially, you'll start working on your project. You guys will hopefully be in close communication. You'll have an idea of what they're looking for. You know what you want to write. And so you begin working, and then you can send them your first draft. And typically what they'll do at that first stage is instead of doing like line edits, they'll kind of just do like big picture kind of edits, maybe some reformatting here and there, and send you like an edit note. And so then you go back, you can discuss it with your agent, you guys work on that, and then back and forth until you get a complete manuscript that you both are happy with. And then once that's done, then you go into production, the transmittal process, which is a whole different beast.
Thank you, Makayla. Pronoy, do you want to talk a little bit about how you like to work with authors? I hope there's a lunch involved.
I mean, well, there's always a lunch involved, but I just want to sort of step back a little bit on what Naomi was saying. I mean, look, I think one of the things that becomes integral, and it's certainly integral to my process, is, especially on proposals that I want to pursue and I'm interested in, is to first meet with the author, and even if there are, and I often do have comments in terms of where I see areas of improvement or where I see things that could make this even better, and to really sort of build a kind of, you want to make sure that your visions are aligned, and that alignment will then set the stage for the relationship to come, because trust goes both ways, and sometimes there are editors who want authors to do it a certain way, and the author is like they're not seeing it that way, and you don't want to really be in a situation where you're just not seeing eye to eye, and it can be very uncomfortable for the author and uncomfortable for the publisher. And so I think it's very important to build a rapport and build a sense of trust early. And then from there, what I tend to do is I work with all my authors extremely collaboratively and work through all of the issues in a sort of deliberate process. And, the other thing too that authors, and this is where agents can help too, is that, look, like there is a reason to not only go with a certain editor who both shares your vision, because that editor is also your in-house spokesperson. They're promoting you internally. They're your voice inside, but it's also important to be a part of a house, if you're lucky enough to get a deal that also understands how to publish you. There are a lot of houses that don't know how to publish certain types of books, and even if you have a great relationship with your author, it doesn't necessarily, or a great relationship with your editor, it doesn't necessarily mean that things will work out the way you envision, because there's just no, the institution, as it were, is just not built to do a book like this well. And so I think it's really important first to also understand and ask questions yourself about, well, how not only do you want to build a rapport with the editor, but also, like, what do you see for me? Like, for example, like I acquired Rick Perlstein. He's a prominent historian, published many best-selling books and has won numerous awards for SNS for many years. And he's doing a book for me. And, we sort of jointly came to the idea together. The proposal that he had out was, I thought, not very good. And we spent a lot of time sort of carefully calibrating it in a way that I thought was more powerful. And, someone like Rick was in high demand. Like, a lot of people wanted to publish him. I mean, he's just one of a kind in this respect. But what I told him was that, a place like Little Brown, you're going to be the only historian for that season. And that means that all our resources are going to go into publishing our big history, which has to be your history, because we don't have that many historians on the program. And that was very exciting for him. You know, he came from a place that published, like, he would not know, and then all of a sudden, the day before his book is about to come out, Bob Woodward just like drops a book, and he's just like, whoa, like I can't get in touch with anybody over there because like they're all dealing with Bob Woodward, who is now dealing with the fact that the president of the United States is suing their publisher. So like, you know, for him, it was like very exciting to think about the possibility of being at a place where he really wouldn't have any internal competition in terms of attention. And all of those factors factor into the relationship. And then in terms of the editorial process, I mean, that's the beauty of the nonfiction proposal, is like that you get to work with an editor, hopefully, that understands what you're trying to do, is your advocate, is someone who really believes in you. And, you know, it often becomes like you're both an editor, a therapist. Sometimes you have to do a lot of things to help people get to the finish line, but with a shared mission in mind. And so I think that relationship builds over time, and it really is a really important one, and something that authors should not take for granted, and should certainly be attuned to wanting to work with someone who truly understands what they're trying to do, so that they don't, 6 months later, find themselves in a situation where they're trying to write a book that their editor just doesn't understand,
Excellent. Thank you. We have about 15 minutes left, so I was going to go to questions. If you want to put some questions into the chat, there are a couple here. There's a question about the oral histories, oral biographies, and the best one to me is the Edie Sedgwick biography by Gene Stein and George Plimpton, which is amazing. And there's also a great oral history of the Saturday Night Live crew. Does anyone have an opinion about whether or not those are easy? Do they work? Do they sell well? Pronoy, is that something that you look to acquire?
I think that oral histories are really tough. I think oral histories work if they are connected to popular television shows where you have people on the record. Like if you do an oral history of 30 Rock, okay, because you'll have Tina Fey and all these people talking on background, and it provides a perspective into the show for fans that they wouldn't have otherwise. But I think the form, the genre of oral history, the age of Stud Terkel, is very, very challenging. It's harder nowadays, I think, especially with things like podcasting, and it's just like the oral history form, I think, is a bit obsolete. I always recommend, when people do have material that fits into oral history, like that would, quote unquote, be, I would say that's your zero draft. And if you can turn that into something more engaging, and not simply an oral history, it can be helpful. And using the interviews and the conversations, and then shifting it a bit to make it a better read. I mean, I remember years ago working at SNS, they did an oral history of everybody who knew J.D. Salinger, and it's just tough. It's like you're reading like 100 different people just riffing on like what they think, and it doesn't have a kind of cohesion. Although, like I said, I think if you do like an oral history of Lost or an oral history of some of those shows, yes, they do very well. But unless it's got that, really powerful, it's like the oral history of Seinfeld, yeah, that would be a huge hit. But I don't think that just an oral history without that kind of pop culture thing to base it on, I think it's much harder. And I would encourage people to see if they could use that material as research into and turning it into a more narrative form.
I think that's really great. I mean, it does seem to be very bold-faced names. I mean, the fun of the Edie Sedgwick is to get, you know, all these different Andy Warhol hangers-on, their take, and it does go through the narrative of her life. So it's really kind of fascinating. I don't know, Naomi or Makayla, do you have anything to add to that?
I have absolutely no experience with oral history, so I am sure Pronoy covered it.
Excellent. So there's a question about any, are there any career moves that you can do while still an undergraduate or still studying? Does it matter what you major in? Does it matter doing internship? Does it matter reaching out to folks? Are there conferences that college students or graduate students can go to that will put them around publishing? Makayla, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think it's incredibly important to do as many internships as possible, especially while you're still in school. And while you're at those internships, don't just do the work, but talk to as many people as you can, and try to talk to them like outside of the office. Like talk to them and get to know them, but then ask, can we grab coffee after work or during a lunch break or whatever? And so those people will remember you. And then if there's a full-time position ever, then they'll think of you. I think that was what was really influential for me. Like I mentioned, I had a few publishing internships, but none of them were with like the big five, which I thought was going to like hinder my ability to really get into the industry. But it didn't, because I was able to make those connections. And so that's what I would really recommend, is talking to as many people as you can, doing as many internships as possible, even if you're in grad school, doing as many internships as possible and just making those connections for sure.
Yeah, to add to that, I really think it's all about who you know. And like Makayla was saying, it's all about connections. And, I started as receptionist at InkWell, and like worked my way up, and also kind of like pushing yourself forward. Like one of the partner's assistants left, and I had the audacity to say like, oh, I would love to interview for that role. And thank God I didn't get it, because I was so ill-equipped for it. But but they did still like push me up and kind of like put me into that onto that track, and I'm really grateful for that, just because they did so much training. But I think you just have to kind of always make yourself known and say exactly what you want and talk to as many people as you can. Also in terms of like degree, I mean, I studied political science. Not even in America, I don't think it matters actually that much.
I think, oh, sorry. I wanted to just
Go ahead. No,
speak
go ahead.
to the degree point. I feel like people assume that you have to have an English degree, which I don't think is true at all. I think a lot of people do have an English degree, but I think that if you have a different degree, it'll make you stand out amongst a sea of English degrees. So.
Excellent. Yeah, I purposely didn't study English because I thought, oh my God, if I study English at Columbia, I'm going to go into publishing, and that would be a bad career move. So I taught them. Bruno, your background is in history, right? You went pretty far. Like you're like.
Oh, I was gonna be a cognitive linguist.
A carpenter?
A carpenter, no. A cognitive linguist. That was my.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So I was definitely not an English major. I think I agree with everything that Naomi and Makayla are saying. I really like people with not unconventional backgrounds. I think that the key thing to remember is that this is an apprenticeship business. It's not something that you can learn through school. It's through trial and error, and it's a very small industry, and it's very much a relationship industry. So while pursuing internships, the most important thing I would say is to just do set up basically informational calls with as many people as you can, and gloss off as much information as you can. Read the other thing that a lot of the things that we're talking about people trying to enter a business. A lot of the mistakes that I see, and I myself had to learn the hard way, is, when you walk into a bookstore today, Barnes and Noble, everything you see there, for the most part, on the first floor, is what everybody in the business today is doing. Makayla is part of it. Naomi's got a part of it. I've got a part of it. My colleagues, their colleagues, Kevin's got that. We're a part of that. And so you, in addition to meeting people, in addition to like, it's really important to meet people. It's really important to ask that person to refer you to another person. And it's also important to read the contemporary state of books, because that's what we're all working on. When people say that, like, what's your favorite book? And they're like, Jane Eyre. I mean, it's great, but like, we're not working on Jane Eyre. Like, those books are like just in our backlist, and we have that. Like, we are working on contemporary work, and like, you are going to be a part of the business of the future of books and the present and future of books. And so the familiarity that you would need to know, like, what is the fiction that is being published? What is the nonfiction that is being published? Like, what is on the bestseller list? Just, and you don't even have to buy them. Go to the library and just, like, new books, like, read them, because that's literally what we are doing. That is what you would be doing. When you join, you're going to be working on that. And there are certain trends that you will notice. There are certain facts you will notice. There are certain details that you will notice about the ways in which books are being published. And that, to me, is so important to when you talk to people, to show that you're actually engaged in the contemporary nature of the publishing industry as it is today, because the people you will be talking to are literally, when you walk into that bookstore, they have spent the last 2 years putting that bookstore, like, what that bookstore is showing is what the people you'll be talking to have been working on. And like, that's what we talk about ourselves. And that's what you want to also start to acclimate yourself and familiarize yourself with. I also love, like, reading, dead authors, but it's not useful, especially when you're starting out, to talk about people who have been, like, who wrote, like, a terrific novel, like Tolstoy. Like, it's great, but like, it's not gonna, you want to read what's going on now and really understand what the business of publishing is doing today. And I think meeting people firsthand, one thing that people don't really realize is that by the time jobs post, it's highly likely that 3 or 4 people have already been interviewed. So HR is actually behind. And we operate very quickly and we move referrals very quickly. So like, when someone needs an assistant, they'll just, like, shoot an email to, like, a BCC group. I get them all the time, and I'll just forward someone that I know and I just met. And the only way to make sure that you can be in that position is to just keep meeting people, because the business is small and positions do crop up, and often they're not visible.
I think that's really great advice. Really great advice. You got to build your network. And there's a class every summer called the Columbia Publishing course, which is given through the School of Journalism. A lot of people in the industry have met there, and they continue to be friends for years and years and build their careers together. That's a really, really great resource. There are a couple different schools that have one, but hey, this one's in your backyard. Looking at the other questions, some of them are pretty specific. So if you want to reach out to me about specific questions, I'd be happy to answer them. I'm also happy to talk to people about other resources for finding an agent or for finding internships, stuff like that. Again, I'm at KO, I'll do that. I'm KO142 at columbia.edu. Let me show that. That's me. And a little bit about a shameless plug for the Center for Nonfiction. I want to thank our guests tonight, Pronoy Sarkar, Makayla Tabron, and Naomi Eisenbeiss. You've been great. It's been a really great audience, really great questions, and really great conversation. And big thank you to Selena, Gabby, Unisha, and Ishel for really supporting me and supporting the project and putting us all in touch with you. I love doing this. It's such a great night. Thank you.
Thank you for organizing.
My pleasure. All right, talk soon. Bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.